So here's one thing that is certainly certain in your association, as it was in mine, is that your association is going to experience pastor transitions on a regular basis. It's always going to be a part of the life cycle of the church and also your association. And so here's what you really need to think through. You need to have a strategy for your association, because transitions are inevitable. They're going to happen, but healthy transitions are not. There's no guarantee that churches in your association are going to experience a healthy transition. And so you need to try to develop a strategy. That's in the title of the role, the associational mission strategist. So you need to develop a strategy to help churches experience healthy transitions. And so what I have developed in the Pike Association, and I've shared with other associational leaders, and I want to share with you this morning, is a strategic and associational framework for healthy transitions. And there's really kind of 5 components to this. First of all is your work with pastor search committees. And that's the one thing that normally comes to mind when you think about how you serve your churches during the season of transition, is to help that pastor search committee. And we'll talk more about that in just a second. That's the common way that associational leaders serve, but it's not the only way. Other ways that you can serve is to help the church during the search, not just the pastor search committee, but help the church honor the Lord and stay together while they are without a pastor. And so we'll talk more about that in just a moment as well. The third component is to focus on interim pastor strategies. And we'll talk more about those in just a moment too. How can you multiply the ministry? Not only as you serving as an interim pastor, but how can you train and equip others to also serve as an interim pastor? Number 4 is to call out the called. There are young men in your churches right now who God is calling to ministry. And so how can you help the churches in your association to call out the called? And then finally, the 5th strategic component is succession planning. As we just saw with the video from Dr. Bryant Wright, succession is a huge need. And so we'll talk more about that in just a few moments as well. So with that, let's talk about component number 1. Let's talk about your work with pastor search committees and how you can strategically help them during this transition season. The first way, as you know, is to train the pastor search committee, and many of you do that very well. You can consult with them throughout the process. You can assist in resume collection. If you receive a bunch of resumes in your association, you can share some of those with them. You can provide regular encouragement and just check in on them and ask them how they're doing and how you can pray for them. And because let's be honest, they probably don't get a lot of encouragement from their church members at times. They get a lot of questions, but they may not get a lot of encouragement. And so you can be that source of encouragement for them. And then you can coach them at times. And actually work with them, especially if they're having a difficulty in one particular area. I remember very recently had a church that had been without a pastor for 3 years. It was a full-time position. It shouldn't have been that much trouble, but they were out of options, out of answers. And so they called me, and I sat down with them and kind of went through some of the process. And I asked them, how many resumes have you received? Things like that. They'd received 200 resumes in a 3-year period. And so then I asked them to kind of define what the top characteristics that they were looking for their next pastor. And so they gave me a list of 6 or 7. And then I just asked them the question, all right, then how many of those 200 resumes met all of that criteria? And their answer was only 1. And he was no longer interested. And so I shared with them at that moment, you've got to kind of adjust your expectations a little bit. And they certainly did that. And I actually coached them through some interviews, and they called a pastor within the next 4 months. And so sometimes you need to do that. Sometimes you need to help those churches say, hey, let me walk alongside you. Let me help you. Let me ask you some questions and offer some pointers. As you know, in your association, much like it was in the Pike Association, that you can offer advice, but you can't tell them what to do. And sometimes they take that advice, sometimes they don't. But this is typically the way that most associational leaders focus helping the church during the season of transition is with the pastor search committee. But again, as I said earlier, it's not the only way. We also know that you can help the church during the search. And so one of the things that I did a few years ago, I was serving as an interim pastor, and I had walked the church from the moment that their previous pastor resigned to their next pastor was coming. And I walked them through a series of messages and talks about how they can honor the Lord during this interim season. And so at the end of that, after they had called their next pastor, one of their deacons came up to me and said, this is really helpful information. You should write a book about it. And I laughed and I said, listen, I'm bivocational myself. There's really no time to do that. And then a few months later, COVID happened. And so during that time, my schedule freed up quite a bit. And so during that time, I wrote the book, The Church During the Search, to help the average church member honor the Lord in their attitudes and their behaviors. And so you can help the church as well. You can give them a book like this or other resources and kind of help them understand their role during that transition time, because they certainly have a role. They can make things a lot easier for the pastor search committee, or they can make things a lot more difficult, not only for the pastor search committee, but also for their next pastor. And so you want to encourage and help the church as much as you can to honor the Lord in their attitudes and behaviors. And so what I do in the book is I challenge church members to make 6 commitments. And those are listed on the screen there for you now. Number 1, be prepared. Be prepared to not know who's preaching on Sunday. Be prepared to be surprised that things are not always going to go according to plan. Be prepared not to hear any update from the pastor search committee from time to time. Be prepared to talk about the elephant in the room a lot of times with churches is pastoral compensation. And so that first commitment is that church members need to be prepared for those situations that they undoubtedly will face during that transition season. Number 2 is be informed. They need to be informed about let me back up before I say that. Every church member has opinions about what faithfulness looks like in their pastor. But the question is how does God define faithfulness for pastors? And so you need to help them to be informed from that. And if you look up the word pastor in most New Testaments, you'll find the English translations only show that word up one time, in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11. But that word, the Greek word is poimen, and it's found in the New Testament in 16 other places. And every one of those times it's translated as shepherd. And so you need to help them to understand the roles of a shepherd so that they can be informed to understand what faithfulness looks like in God's eyes for their pastor. Number 3, you need to encourage them to be humble. Everybody has preferences. Everybody has desires, but they can't allow those desires for their next pastor to become demands. And so you need to challenge them to be humble. Number 4 is be prayerful. They need to be praying throughout the process. They need to pray for their church, for the unity to remain in their church. You need to pray for their pastor search committee, for their next pastor, for their pastor's wife, his family, all of those things. They can be praying for that throughout the season of transition. They can be patient. This is a long process. And they need to be patient and understand that these things take time. There's volunteers are involved in this process. They can't give enough time to it that others would deal with in the business world. And so they need just to simply be patient during this season of transition. And then the 6th and final commitment that church members need to make while they're waiting for their next pastor is they need to be productive. The church is still the church, even without a pastor. The Great Commission still applies, even when there is no pastor. And so you want to do what you can to help those local churches, that the average church member sitting in a pew, to honor the Lord while they wait for their next pastor. So that's the second component. One other thing that you can do here, you can do small group studies with the book. I've provided sermon outlines on my website, and that'll be listed at the end of the presentation. You can find sermon outlines there. There's even a congregational covenant where you challenge the church members to make these 6 commitments. And so hopefully that's a resource for you. So that's component number 2. component number 3, not only do you need to serve the pastor search committees, not only do you need to help the church during the search, but you also need to develop as an associational leader some interim pastor strategies. So you can enlist others to help you. You can equip others. You can encourage others to multiply your ministry. You can only be in one place at one time. Just like Jesus, when Jesus walked this earth, he was only in one place at one time. But sometimes you're going to have several churches that need your help. And so the way to do that is to identify and equip others in your association that can serve as interim pastors. As you do so, you can develop them in several ways. You can give them preaching plans. You can give them sermon outlines. You can give them books, topics that they should think about covering during the interim. You can provide individual coaching and mentoring. What I did in the Pike Association is that I actually would meet with some of these brothers who were serving as interim pastors about once every month and just ask them, hey, how's it going? What challenges are you facing right now? How can I help? And we would just talk. And so you can do that with those men who have been called to serve as interim pastors in your association. And you may even consider developing interim pastor cohorts where you get several men together on a regular basis and just talk about what interim pastor work looks like. How can they serve one another? What ideas can they share? And so those are all ways that you as an association leader can help your churches to experience healthy transitions by providing resources for these interim pastors. So that's something to think about. The 4th component, we've done 3 so far. Number 1 is helping the pastor search committee. Number 2 is helping the church itself during the search. Number 3 is working with and equipping interim pastors. But then number 4 is helping to call out the called in your association. Call out the called. This is one that's near and dear to my heart because I live in an area that is rural. It's in Central Appalachia. If you ever heard of the Hatfield-McCoy feud, that's where I serve. And so churches are kind of isolated from one another. A lot of people aren't moving to this area. A lot of people are moving out of this area. And so there are seasons where it's very difficult to find men who can serve as pastors. People aren't moving to Eastern Kentucky for bivocational positions. And so I'm convinced that God is calling men in our churches to serve as pastors. And so we've got to do what we can, working with local churches, working with local pastors to call out the called. And so you can do that. You can develop a strategy to discover, develop, and deploy future pastors. And so 3 aspects of that: discover, develop, deploy. I'll walk through these pretty quickly. Number 1, you need to discover, and that begins with prayer. In Luke chapter 10, verse 2, Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest. And so it begins with prayer, asking the Lord to call out those whom he is already giving the desire and the gifts to serve him in pastoral ministry. You can communicate the need among your churches through social media and newsletters. You can talk to current pastors about men in their church who might be called. And so you can do those types of things. Then one of the things that we did in the Pike Association that I think is really helpful is we actually developed a call to ministry workshop. And this was an interactive workshop to help potential pastors evaluate their calling in a very safe and private environment. And so it would combine classroom teaching with personal assessments. And you can do it in different ways. You can do it all in one session, several hours. We did it in 3 consecutive Tuesday nights and had several men that went through this workshop. The 6 assessments are expectations. You need to help a brother kind of think through, what do you expect out of ministry? Are you expecting a lot of pats on the back? Are you expecting that everybody's going to love you? Or are you expecting to make a lot of money? You know, what are your expectations for ministry? And help a brother to adjust those expectations as needed. Another one is motivations. What are your motivations for ministry? Are you doing this to please somebody in your family because grandma thinks that you'd be a fine preacher, or what are your motivations for ministry? And you help them to think through that. The next one is very important, and that's the biblical qualifications. Regardless if you think you're called to ministry, you're not called to ministry if you don't meet those biblical qualifications. And so you can teach through that and help them to give themselves a self-assessment, but then also give the assessment to their pastor, to their spouse, to those who know them well, and help them to also evaluate this individual's biblical qualifications and see if there are any gaps there, see if there are any blind spots maybe that he doesn't see himself. Then there's a spiritual gifts assessment. We used Lifeway's spiritual gift inventory. It's very helpful, and so you could use that. And then the affirmations assessment. Do other people see the calling of God on the individual's life? And so we go through that workshop. They go through each of those assessments. And then once all of those assessments are completed, you can review those and you can provide a written report of your observations. And then you can meet individually with them and you can talk about it. And you can try to talk those out of ministry who you don't really see or sense that God is truly calling them to the ministry. But those who are, man, you can encourage them and you can equip them and you can work with their pastor to see that they have all kinds of opportunities to serve in the future. So if you got any questions about this call to ministry workshop, I'll share my email in just a few minutes, and you can email me or you can find me on social media, and I'll be glad to give you more information about the workshop. After you've discovered the call, then you need to develop them. You can provide a list of resources that they can use to develop that calling. Dr. Jeff Orge, I think, is going to be on here in just a few minutes. His book, Is God Calling Me?, is a fantastic resource that helps them kind of solidify that calling in their mind. You can offer seminary extension or provide scholarships or Bible college or seminary, whatever it is. You may even want to develop your own training, but you want to equip these brothers who God has called, who may not go to seminary or Bible college themselves, but you can equip them to serve. You can partner with churches to provide ministry internship opportunities. We've had several of those in the Pike Association. You can provide pulpit supply opportunities for them in the association. You can even provide interim pastor opportunities. Let them kind of test the water without that long-term commitment of serving in a church. But I would give also this word of caution. You do want to exercise discernment in recommending them to churches. You can provide a list of names of those that have gone through the workshop and may have a calling on their life, but you certainly don't want to provide just a blanket endorsement. Their pastor knows them a lot better than you do. And so as an associational leader, you can share some insights, but you want to exercise discernment in recommending them to specific churches in your association. Okay, so that's the fourth component, but there's a fifth component of a strategic framework for associations, and that final component is succession planning. You want to encourage pastors to consider developing a succession plan as they approach retirement and help them. This a lot of times is a private matter. They may not want their church to know that they're considering retirement, but you can have those conversations kind of in the background, and then when that appropriate time comes, they can express that desire that they want to retire in the near future. And so you can kind of talk through that succession plan with them. You can provide resources and training on the topic. Dr. Bryant Wright's book is a good resource. There are others that are out there, but you just want to begin to help pastors think about this and think about what the church is going to look like after God has called them onto either retirement or another ministry. All right. So again, your goal should be to help the churches of your association experience healthy leadership transitions. And 5 strategic components that you can focus on is you can work with the pastor search committees. You can work with the church during the search, help them honor the Lord while they wait for their next pastor. You can develop interim pastors, equip them and help them. You can help to call out the called in your association, in the churches. And then you can also help churches think about succession planning. So 5 strategic ways to help churches experience healthy pastor transitions. So again, my name is Jason Lowe. That's my email address, jason.lowe@kybaptist.org. You can find me on the web at jasonalowe.com. And then that's my cell phone number. You can reach me directly at 606-794-4684. And again, you will get a copy of this PowerPoint slide And so you can reach out to me with any questions, any way I can help you. I will be glad to do so.